Okay. Hello to my audience, friends, and family. This is India Insight with Sunny Sharma. I'm super excited today to have one of the most prominent Indian intellectuals of the modern era on my podcast. As you've heard some of my audio podcasts that I've been doing for the past 4 years, I am privileged today for my first ever video visual podcast to have an intellectual trendsetter in the areas of quantum computing, linguistic connections between ancient cultures, ancient Vedic ideas of cosmology, physics, and science, history revisionism, and so much more. Dr. Subhash Kak is Regents Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater. His legacy speaks for itself. He has authored and co-authored at least 20 books on a variety of topics. He was awarded the Science Medal of the Indian National Science Academy in the autumn of 1977 at the Indian Science Congress given to him by Prime Minister Morarji Desai. Moreover, he was awarded the title of Vishwa Hindu by Sri Ganapati Sachchidananda Swami, the spiritual head of Avadhoota Datta Peetham, a major center for Vedic studies and spiritual life. And most of all, in 2019, Dr. Kak was awarded the very prestigious Padma Shri for his immense contributions in multiple areas of expertise. I highly recommend for my audience to learn a little bit more about his intellectual legacy and trajectory throughout his career to read his book In the Circle of Memory and Autobiography. He has accomplished so much that it's better, without further delay, to start the conversation to delve into some of his ideas more deeply. And I do have a copy of his book, which I did read, right here. I don't know if you can see it. I think it's being blocked by the background, but um, my first question for you, Dr. Kak, is I've read a little bit about you through the internet and also through some of your books. What was your first love, writing, history, or computer science?
Well, when I was growing up in Kashmir, I wanted to be an author. So my first love was literature. And I started writing very early on in my early teens, fiction and short stories and other stuff. But then my mother was a very practical person, said, no way, how will you support yourself as a writer? Because at that time, long time ago, there were not that many opportunities for people to make money off writing. So she says, no, you have no choice. You have to do engineering. So she packed me off to the engineering college in Kashmir, and off there I went. And then one thing led to another. I did my PhD, etc. But I kept my interest in literature alive, and of course, I also read a lot of history. I can tell you, in my early teens, I had read about 30 biographies of Napoleon in my early teens. We had read all the books then, a town called Anantnag. So it had a small library. So I literally read all the books on history and philosophy or science that one could find there. So in any event, I went off and did my PhD, but I kept my interest in literature alive and started with books and poetry. And as far as history is concerned, or serious history is concerned, see, by serious, I mean academic, where you publish in peer-reviewed journals. That happened about 30 years ago, 30 odd years ago. And the background to that was that in the mid 80s, I was working on machine translation. And then I remembered, okay, machine translation, you want to go from one language to another. You need to map the grammar of one to the other, right? To have vocabulary, dictionary, which tells you what words correspond to each other. Although the meaning of words can change based on context, and sometimes words have multiple meanings. But in any event, you also have to know how to represent the grammar. And that's when I realized or remembered that my when I was young, used to tell me that Sanskrit, which was written about 2,500 years ago by somebody called Panini, who wasn't very far away from, who lived just outside of Kashmir. Um, so this grammar represented the entire structure of Sanskrit language in 4,000 rules. And that came as a kind of a shock that since then, nobody has tried or has been able to successfully represent the grammar of any language in any number of pages, let alone 4,000 algebraic rules. So it raised this question: why is it that history books told us that India had no writing in 500 BC, and writing came to India only with Alexander, with the Greeks, which was about 2,300 years ago, not 2,500 years ago. Because the question arises, how would somebody without recourse to writing be able to represent 4,000 algebraic rules where every nuance to the sound matters? Can't be done, right? We can't remember more than 5 numbers at the same time. 5 digits, in fact. In fact, the reason why telephone numbers are broken into 3 groups is so that one can remember them. So this made me question the standard histories of India that we have. And I told myself that I should investigate this whole history of Indian science that I had read because I was done a lot of reading for years. And so I started off looking at the layers of literature that we had before Panini, so before 500 BCE. So that brings us to layers of literature called Sutra, or before that you have Aranyakas, before that you have Brahmanas, before that you have the Vedas. And while I was doing that, I discovered a long lost astronomy of the Vedic period, which had been lost for about 2,000 years. And I made a discovery of something I call the astronomical code of the Rig Veda. I wrote a book on that in the mid-90s. And after that, I also write many, many books on history of Indian mathematics, astronomy, linguistics, etc., etc. And that's been going on until today as we speak.
Wow. So really it sounds like from a very young age you were very interested in languages. Is that one of the reasons why you got into linguistics?
I was interested in languages from the beginning because my mother would talk to me in Kashmiri. My dad would often talk to me in Hindi and sometimes in English. And then we used to have people work at our home, some of whom knew Kashmiri or Hindi. Could be a servant, for example, who knew only Gujari Bhasha. Right? Or they could be Punjabi. My father also spoke Punjabi. So I grew up in an atmosphere there where there were many languages being spoken around me. And that's what got me interested into linguistics.
Okay. So also about the Vedas, you talk about this a little bit in your autobiography also. Can you explain how Vedic ritual has a scientific basis and how the Vedas address both the knowledge of outer reality and the subjective self?
Yeah, well, I missed part of your question, but that doesn't matter because your image froze for some
Yeah,
time.
we're having some problem with the video, but
Okay, all
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Okay, but let me come back to the Vedas. The word Veda means wisdom or knowledge. Now, of course, modern science gives us knowledge, right? But that is knowledge of the outer world. Whether you're talking about physics, which is, matter, or chemistry, or biology, this is all outer world. And what the Vedic tradition says that there are 2 kinds of knowledge. One is the knowledge of the outer world, and this could also include world of abstractions, of ideas, such as sociology. Sociology doesn't deal with physical objects. It deals with relationships between bodies or persons. But so it's more abstract. Or psychology or linguistics itself is knowledge, but it's not material knowledge. So the Vedic tradition acknowledges that, but then what it says is that there is another kind of knowledge which is related to the very process of observation. related to the observer within us. Because um, the Western tradition only deals with things outside of us. The Indian tradition deals with things outside of us, but it also deals with us ourselves. Because the observer within you or me is a part of me, but it's also separate from my physical body. Because you can always say, hey, my arm is hurting. But who's this my? It's not your arm. The my is different from your arm. Or you can say, well, my eye, something wrong with my eye. So your eye is not you. Your eye is an instrument, right? Our tongue is an instrument. Our arms and legs, limbs are instruments. Some instruments are for, say, motion. Some instruments are related to the senses through which we make a sense of the world, right? So the Indian tradition is the only one, the Vedic tradition is the only one which makes this distinction. So just as you have the outer cosmos, you have the inner cosmos related to your mind and consciousness. Now, what's interesting is that modern science now has reached a frontier where consciousness is the ultimate mystery. So whether you look at it from the perspective of computer science, why computer science? Well, computers can do things, but they're not conscious. So where does consciousness come in from? So that is a challenge in computer science. Or in physics, well, here you have these laws, but who's the individual who is perceiving these laws? Or psychology, if the self is inside the brain, right? The self, meaning the conscious observing self, is inside the brain. Where exactly in the brain? Is it in the cortex or somewhere else? And if, let's say, there is a certain part of the brain where the self is located, where the observer is located, but then who is observing uh, this uh, neural complex? So that you can have a whole sequence within the brain where you have different substructures who are observing themselves, which leads to paradoxical situations, right? So the Vedas are the only tradition in the world. Of course, there were mystical traditions elsewhere as well. Let me be fair or clear. Every culture, there have been mystics or sages who talked about the mystery, but they talked about it in poetry or they talked about it in religious passion, right? They didn't talk about it in scientific terms. So Vedas are really the science of the inner cosmos, and it's truly extraordinary. I've studied them in a variety of ways. I've written about them. And since I also know modern science, I've worked in neuroscience, I've worked in quantum mechanics. I can tell you there is nothing in the whole of world literature which is as extraordinary as what the Vedas tell us.
So you think the Vedic perspective on consciousness is unique? There's no other ancient or modern perspective that is similar about consciousness. And also I want to ask, um, why were the ancient Vedic and Vedic learners and Upanishad intellectuals, why were they so obsessed with this notion of consciousness and self? Why did they delve into this?
Well, for every human being, once you've grown up, you've started living, you have family, etc., you start wondering, who am I? Right? Firstly, when you're younger, you're very busy. You're doing in the olden world. There were things to be done. You had to help out at home, or then when you had a job, you had to provide for your family, your wife, your children. So there's not that much of time to think about, hey, who am I? But sooner or later, once you grow older, you start asking yourself, am I, it's just an accident of my birth that this is where I am, or this is where my family is, or this is who my children are, or my relatives are. But who really am I? And that's where the Vedic sages were able to bring in a perspective which, as I mentioned, is totally extraordinary. And it is scientific. It's the science of consciousness. It's the science of self. Now, it can't be a science like our normal sciences. Why? Because the normal sciences deal with things, while the observation process is not a thing. The observer is not a thing. The consciousness is not a thing. Consciousness is what makes it possible for us to see things, but you cannot see consciousness. You see that? So that's why the Vedic rishis use a very uh, special language which is full of paradox. There are all kinds of oppositions which come together when the Vedic rishis speak about the mystery of consciousness. And that's what has also been realized by modern scientists, that when you talk of consciousness, there are paradoxes. Because firstly, the paradox that you are outside of it, but you're also a part of it, which is paradoxical, right? You are talking about yourself, but you are also you yourself. Where does the boundary lie? And so on.
Interesting. Um, can I go to a different subject actually?
Of
Um,
course, anything you want.
so you coined the term quantum neurocomputing, correct? And
Right.
then there are the three languages of the brain. Could you explain those languages?
Okay. Uh, how does the brain work? This is a question that one might ask. One is that through our senses, we see things which are related. And so there's an association, right? And you give names. For example, you see an animal, and then you say it's a cow or it's a horse. So that is associational language. A lot of what we learn, or what our normal knowledge is associational. And we see this, even our pets doing it. You tell the pet, okay, here is this, fetch the ball. So the pet knows that this round object is a ball, right? So that is one aspect of knowledge. The other aspect is that brain, based on what it's doing, reorganizes itself. A lot of people don't know that. For example, there was this famous neuroscience experiment where a monkey was given a task of repetitively turning a wheel with his index finger. And the neurosurgeon had also opened up his motor cortex, a part of the brain which controls motor movements, physical movements. And the fingers are mapped to the motor cortex. So there's a certain part of the motor cortex which maps the finger, the index finger, right, like other fingers. So the neurosurgeon discovered that as he did it again and again, the area of the brain corresponding to the index finger grew in size, which means that the brain was reorganizing itself, right? So what we do changes ourselves. That's why education is so important, because by educating ourselves or by getting educated, our brain is changing. So that is the second reorganizational language. The third is quantum. Now, what does the word quantum mean? Quantum means whole, holistic, right? Because we also have a sense of wholes, that, even about ourselves, you or I, we keep on changing. You may shave one day, or you may not shave another day, or we may lose all our hair, but we'll still be the same individual. What is it that gives us the capacity to see that wholeness? Our memories are lost or forgotten, slowly as we age, or as the time when that memory was formed becomes more distant, more and more of that is lost, right? Our physical body gets changed. The cells get changed in a few years. So we are not the same cells that we are born with, but still we are the same individual. So there is a wholeness also to us, which is captured by this language, which I call quantum. Yeah, so I was the first person to say that there are three kinds of languages. And since our ordinary language that we use when we are in the high school, when we are in high school or in college. It deals with associative information, right? Like psychology or anatomy. We are being told this is the name of this part of the body, right? Anatomical knowledge is associative knowledge. Or stories are associative. They tell us, what happened to some individual and so on. So that was very interesting. I think that was a very unique way of looking at the problem and arguing why certain kinds of knowledge that we are familiar with may not be complete. So that's what it was all about. Yeah, in fact, the very famous, world famous neuroscientist Carl Pribram, who passed away 4 or 5 years ago, he invited me to speak on this at the conference that he used to organize, and then this chapter, a very long chapter, is included in the proceedings of that conference.
Wow, very interesting. I mean, as a historian, I'm not as well versed in the scientific realms of things, but um, yeah, I do. I was also wondering, you talk about in one of your books, your autobiography, about two very important texts. You talk about the Yoga Vashista, is that how you pronounce it? And you also talk about the Vashishka Sutra. Um, Wait, did you hear that?
Vaisheshik Sutra? The
Vashishka. Yeah. So
Vaisheshik, right, right.
could you explain a little bit if you remember, could you explain why those two books were so groundbreaking for their scientific
Uh,
perspective?
the Vaisheshik Sutra goes to about 500 BCE, which is 2,500 years ago, and it is ascribed to a sage called Kanad, and it gives a atomic theory of physical reality. There was atomism in Greece as well, but this is much prior to that. And not only that, it has two of the three laws of motion that Newton has in his physics, already almost in exactly the same words. It's amazing. Indians are not aware of this book. I also wrote a book on it called Matter and Mind. If you don't have it, you might want to take a look at that. The other book, Vasishta, Yoga Vasishta, is an incredible book. You can view it as a novel. It's a fat book. It's the third longest book in the Sanskrit language. After Mahabharata and Ramayana comes Yoga Vasishta. And it's full of stories within story genre. And since you are a Kashmiri as well, you'll be happy to learn that scholars believe it was written in Kashmir. And when exactly, there is some dispute. Some say maybe 1,500 years ago, or maybe on either side of that. And what it does is it has such sophisticated ideas on time, on space, on evolution, on nature, not in terms of equations, in terms of philosophy, narrated in a very charming way that, in my view, it's one of the most remarkable books ever written. Now, I also talk about it. In fact, I have some excerpts from it in my new book, which was published 5-6 months ago, which is a book on Kashmir called Whispers from the Past, Art and Wisdom of Kashmir. You might want to take a look at it.
I ordered it, but it hasn't come in yet.
Okay. So
Yeah.
there are a couple of chapters from Yoga Vasishta in that book, and it also gives the related story. When was it written, and who was the king, and why was it being developed, etc.
Wow. So I'll definitely want to look into those books because they sound very interesting. Um, and also because you mentioned that part of it is written in Kashmiri, or part of it, or all of it.
All of it, perhaps, because it has a
Okay.
structure. Yeah.
So you mentioned in your autobiography that My question for you is, you say, why did the classic arts and sciences of Kashmir come to an abrupt end when Islam became the politically dominant in the 14th century? So do you have an explanation for why?
Yeah, of course. I think historians are fairly knowledgeable about what happened because Kashmir had this classical tradition, maybe 1500-year long or longer of scholarship. In my view, it was perhaps the most brilliant phase anywhere on earth of this extended duration. Of course, early Greeks, a lot of wonderful stuff was done by early Greeks, or the Roman period, a lot of wonderful stuff was done there, or by the Mesopotamians, but not 1400, which is almost 18 years. And there were all kind of stuff. There was grammar, there was art, there was painting, there was music, great Sanskrit classic, there was philosophy. Almost any region of creativity that you want to take a look at, it was done in Kashmir. Grammar, architecture. So what happened was around 1400, 1340 or whatever, um, uh, the kingdom of Kashmir fell, and there were outsiders who came in from Central Asia, and so they were iconoclasts. They wanted to destroy all the arts. And in the beginning, it took some time. And one of the particularly bad kings, his name was Sikandar, he ordered that all books be destroyed, or all temples and all art be destroyed. So that's what happened. So what happened was that Islam, when it came in, didn't want the old tradition, which of course now is being celebrated all across the world. You go all over the world, people will talk about Kashmir Shaivism, which is a approach to philosophy which brings in both sciences and the arts within its ambit. So everybody talks about Kashmir Shaivism. So they talk about Kashmir, they're celebrating Kashmir. And all these books had to sort of had to be kept alive in people's homes, or some people left Kashmir and kept these, preserved these books. But now there is a resurgence, a renaissance taking place, and people do want to know about it. And there are lots of Europeans and Americans and others who are studying this, who are also doing the ritual, including a friend of mine. Never met him personally, but he's a very famous artist from Western Australia. His name is Christian D. Vitri. Just a few months ago, he published an original book in Kashmir Shaivism. Right now, he's in Oxford University. So there's a lot of regeneration, reawakening that is taking place related to Kashmir.
Wow, wow. So back to linguistics. What is the connection between the Brahmi Semitic and Indus script, and how does it point to the origin of language?
The Brahmi script is the historical early script of India. All the stuff that you find in all the Indian languages, the scripts go back to Brahmi. And the earliest examples of Brahmi are Ashokan inscriptions. Ashoka was 230 BCE. Ashoka inscriptions are Brahmi. After Brahmi came, Sharda script from Kashmir, much later, or Devanagari. Devanagari followed Sharda, or scripts of South India. They all are derived from Brahmi. Or go outside of India, you go to Burma or Java, Indonesia, or Philippines. Those scripts are also derived from Brahmi. So Brahmi is the mother script. Okay. Now there was this theory, before I did my historical researches, there was this theory that Brahmi is derived from a Western Asian script. Okay. Now, one of the most important contributions that I made, and this was late 80s, I did a scientific study, the like of which had not been done before, between Brahmi script, where, as I told you, the standard theory was that it had come perhaps from Western Asia, and the Indus script, which is 4,000 to 5,000 years old, 2,500 BC, right? Now, we have a lot of stuff in the Indus script, and we know the frequency of its various symbols, right? Because you can collate them. And we have the frequency of Brahmi symbols as well. So the study that I did was I took the Brahmi symbols in decreasing probability or decreasing frequency and looked at Indus symbols in decreasing probability. And we found, and I showed mathematically, and I published this in the leading journal of the world, which is called Cryptologia. And I showed that they were almost identical in their location for the first 10, the most frequent symbols, from which one could only argue or gather or conclude that Brahmi is derived from Indus, so that the ancestry of Brahmi goes back to 2,500 BCE, not just 500 BCE, which again is consistent with this idea that Sanskrit is much older than people have been willing to give it credit for. Because the Vedic texts themselves say we are very ancient. Vedic texts have astronomical references which go back to 3000 BC. But Western scholars or Indologists, Western Indologists, when they came into India, they started saying that, well, maybe, in fact, they said Sanskrit was brought to India by European people, that you didn't have it. You were Indus script people, were not European, you were Dravidians, and we came in and we taught Sanskrit to you, so it really belongs to us. Now it's very funny. The Greeks have an ancient history, goes back 500, 800, 1000 BC. The Romans also have great past. The Germans had no past. The Germans were called barbarians by the Greeks. So what now the German scholars, it's very funny, very amusing. In 1800s and 1900s, they said all of Sanskrit is ours. Even though there was no tradition there were no inscriptions, nothing. They said this is ours, and it were the Germanic people who came and settled down there. So the Vedas belong to us. Very, very funny.
Yeah,
history is full of
Max Muller.
yeah, Max Miller and others. So it's very amusing because within the Indian tradition, there is enough evidence of its antiquity that it goes back to 2000, 2500, 3000 BC. And there's no break in the Indian tradition at all, in the Indian archaeological tradition.
So you said you've seen the Ashoka's edict in India, and it was written in Brahmi script. What do I want to ask? I want to ask a little different question. So do you think Western civilization needs the Indian perspective on consciousness in order to develop further? Do you think they've reached kind of an ending point of their ability to understand consciousness? Do you think they need?
Oh, absolutely. See, if you talk to a psychologist or a neuroscientist, they would say consciousness arises out of the complexity of interconnections of the neurons. We have astronomical number of neurons in the brain, every human being, as many neurons as the number of stars in the sky. Did you know that? It's a very interesting coincidence. So the theory is, as the brain developed, through evolution, once the complexity passed a certain threshold, the brain became conscious. But this theory actually is fundamentally flawed. I'll tell you why. In fact, 2 years ago, I published a paper which you can look up. It's called No-Go Theorems in Machine Consciousness. In that, I showed that a machine, no matter how complex, will never be conscious. And And you can see the proof of that. What's the intuition? You might ask me, what's the intuition? What's the central idea behind this claim? The central idea is, if it's complexity which leads to consciousness, imagine a certain complex system. And then now imagine that this is part of another more complex system. Then the more complex system will have subparts of it which are also conscious, which is impossible. Consciousness is a unity, right? A subpart, you are conscious, I'm conscious. A part of me cannot be conscious. I cannot have a subpart within my brain which is conscious. Consciousness is one, right? So this whole idea of threshold-based consciousness, which many computer scientists or neuroscientists have embraced, because as you very nicely put it, the ideas behind all of this science have reached a dead end. So they need to get off this track, so to speak. And the only way to get off that track is to adopt, or is to accept, to get on this other track, which is the Indian approach to consciousness. And there are a lot of very, very smart people in the West. They acknowledge it, they accept it. And there are people, including, a person, I mentioned his name, Carl Pribram, who passed away in his 90s, just some time ago. Many other people, or some of the greatest scientists in the West. The whole framework of quantum mechanics. All of sciences are based on quantum mechanics. Without quantum mechanics, you can't have physics or chemistry or biology. The creator of quantum mechanics, one of the two creators, his name was Erwin Schrödinger. He was an Austrian, but he's also a Vedantin. He believed in the Vedas. And he used to travel wherever he would travel around, he would carry his Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita with him. So he claims in his autobiography that the central idea of quantum mechanics came to him from the Upanishads. And in fact, I can even tell you what that central idea is. I am Atma Brahman, that this Atman is the entire cosmos. I am Atma Brahman. And this gave him the idea that in quantum mechanics, the quantum state should be a superposition of all possible states, which is the central idea.
So I've heard something about that topic, that it's very interesting that some molecule, something like atoms or molecules, can be billions of miles apart but still be affecting each other. I'm not sure if have you heard of that?
That's called entanglement.
So could you explain that a little bit?
What happens is the idea of wholeness. Physics is reductionist, normal physics, right? You and I, we go to school. When we go to school, we study physics in 7th or 8th or 9th or 10th grade. We say this atom is separate from this atom, or this molecule is separate. Everything is broken, reduced. You can separate this object from other objects, right? That's called reductionism. And that's been wonderful. That method has been used in physics and other sciences to come to where we are, which is great progress. So at one level, reductionism is true, right? You and I are separate. That is true. But at another level, at the quantum level, we are all part of one.
So does that point towards unitary consciousness?
Yeah, precisely. So now what they've discovered is it's not only true when it comes to consciousness, that there is only one consciousness, but there are millions of minds, right? Your mind and my mind are different because our memories are different. But our consciousness is the same. That's the Vedic view. And the example that is given is that, look, there is only one sun, outer sun, but that sun can shine in a million different pots of water. You'll see the same orb, right? Mm-hmm. So what quantum mechanics has shown, physicists, experimentalists have shown through their research, that even physical objects remain entangled. And in theory, they could be millions of miles apart. They'll still be connected. If you see something on one, something instantaneously, a change would take place on the other if they are entangled. So this is changing, this is one of those mind-boggling aspects of modern science.
So Another question about math and physics. Does the mathematical structure of the cosmos point to an intelligent design and a divine being? For example, the numbers 12, 27, and 108, how those numbers they appear in nature, and there are probably other patterns that appear in nature as well. So does this point to an intelligent design in some way, or
Well, first of all, since you mentioned the number 108, the guy who discovered its amazing property, I was the guy in 1992. I was reading the New Yorker magazine. There was an essay by John Updike, and he mentions in this essay, isn't it amazing that the size of the sun and the moon is about identical, which is why you have eclipses, right? And the moment I read it, I I knew it had something to do with the Vedas. So I went to the library and my library and I looked up, and then I discovered that there is a code within the very structure of the Rig Veda. It has got 1017 hymns, and they are organized in a particular fashion. And when you decode it, and that all came to me in almost no time, when you decode it, you realize that the sun is 108 times its diameter away from the earth. The moon is 108 times its diameter away from the earth. And modern science also tells us that the diameter of the sun is 108 times the diameter of the earth. Incredible coincidence, right? So I published this in 1992. Then I wrote a book on it called The Astronomical Code of the Rig Veda. I was 4 or 5 years ago, I was at a conference in the Bay Area where there's some of the most famous scientists in the US. And I just chatted with them. I said, do you know about the value of the significance of 108? They said, yes, they've heard about it. So now it's a part of human consciousness. They don't know how it was, how it came into our modern, narratives. In 1992, it came into modern narratives. Now, the whole question of is intelligent design. Well, according to the Vedic view, the whole cosmos is God, meaning consciousness itself is God. You might ask, what is God in the Vedic view? Consciousness is God. Another name for consciousness is Shiva. You see that? So that's why you also say Shivoham, which means Shivaha Aham. Shiva Aham means I am. I. Shiva is I. So the view of God in the Vedic view or Vedic perspective is different from Western view of God. The Western view of God is that God is somewhere out in the sky and looking at us, and he's separate from us. You see that? In the Vedic view, as in the slogan Shivoham, I am Shiva, that we ourselves, the Shiva is within us. Our true self is Shiva. Now that self has gotten embodied in our physical bodies, and we have lost that sense of who we are, which is why we are in suffering, which is why we can't make sense of things, which is why we don't understand what's going on. But if we can turn our gaze, so to speak, and in Kashmir Shaivism, which is this amazing philosophical system, which is equivalent actually to the Vedas, it's called Pratyabhigya, which means self-recognition. If you can turn your gaze and recognize yourself, suddenly you'll become a genius. And that's where all creativity comes in from. I can tell you in my own work, I mentioned the story of John Updike's essay and my discovery of the meaning of 108. All my other research findings have been spontaneous. And it's not just me. Talk to any scientist. If you ask them, how do you make this discovery? They'll say, spontaneously. I don't know where it came from. Or I was dozing off. Or I was dreaming. And I think that also supports this idea that consciousness is where everything comes in from. And consciousness is more than just the activity in the brain. Activity in the brain is one aspect of it. It's a kind of a projection of consciousness. But consciousness transcends us. It's also within us, it also transcends us.
So do you think Western civilization, you mentioned this a little in your book, do you think it's in a crisis intellectually or politically currently? And do you think insight into the mysteries of consciousness can help um help Western civilization recover or unlock its creative potential? Um,
Absolutely. Western civilization, and in fact, all of world civilization, because the rest of the people in the world are aping the West. Western civilization is in great crisis. In fact, the whole last 5 years, with the 73 genders and people confused whether you're a boy or a girl, and chemical castration being done on girls, gender dysphoria, or collapsing world population. Did you know that the world population has started to collapse already? In Asia, in Europe, even in India. In India, the fertility rate has come to replacement, but in 20 years, the population will start to fall. China's population in 80 years will be one-fourth of what it is now. Can you believe it? So amazing stuff is happening because people are lost, both individually. They don't know what life is all about. Look at the fentanyl crisis in the US. 100,000 people dying of fentanyl overdose. Why? Because people don't know what life is all about. They don't, or life is worth living or not. Because if they think they're only bodies are going to die, then is it really worth it? Let me get high, right? It has run out of steam. The only way it can all be saved is to go to the other complementary side of reality, which is consciousness, which the West denies. The West says there's nothing but the mind, but the mind is activity in the brain. It's only memories, etc. It's an adjunct to the body. It's not the true self. So I since truly believe it's a huge crisis point, and the West must discover the founts of creativity within its own tradition, which were also informed by something higher. The Western tradition also accepted something higher. It's only in the last 40, 50 years they have given up on everything. It's only but the body, including the churches. They're only talking about the body. You can't do that. There is a mystery. You must, and that mystery is consciousness. That mystery is right within us. We can touch it, literally. And that is what is called Shiva in the Indian tradition. Shiva is consciousness. It's a name for it.
so why, if these scientists are acknowledging that much of their discoveries come from intuitive insight, why is there such a reluctance to rely on intuitive insight in science? Is there a reluctance or
Well, there are two sides to it. Every scientist would acknowledge that intuition is primary. But but it's fair to say that your intuition can also be wrong. So you must ultimately, even if you got something in your intuition, you must try to validate it using logic. So I'm totally comfortable with that. I think that's the way it should be. You have to appeal to intuition and be informed by your intuition, but you must ultimately use logic to convince others. Just like I'm trying to convince you uh, logically. I'm not saying believe me because I'm telling you. That'll be wrong. That'll be illogical. That's not what the Vedas say. The Vedas say ultimately you must use nyaya. Logic is also called nyaya in the Vedic tradition. You must use logic to explain. And that's why within the tradition, whether you're doing it through Yoga Vasishta, the stories of Yoga Vasishta, or the various Shastras in the Vedic tradition, you always must use logic to advance your position.
okay. So do you think the principle of unity and duality exist at the same time? For instance, in your book, you talk about duality such as the difference between Shiva and Vishnu, how Shiva is the ascetic and Vishnu is the man in the world. Or also duality exists in politics or it exists in different realms. Do you think duality is a principle that um
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great point. there is unity behind it all, but that unity gets projected into multiplicity, duality. There are opposites. So in the real lived world, there are oppositions. There is duality, and you have to acknowledge it. And the art of politics or creativity or whatever you are doing is to bring these two oppositions together in the realm of life, or in the realm of creative discourse, or in the realm of science, in whatever you, or in the realm of your relationships. There are always oppositions. For example, in human relationships as well, you love somebody, but you also want to have your own space. It's not that you can't just be all together all the time. There is, and that is the opposition. There is life, there is also death. They're also complementary pair. Or there is morality, there is creativity, there's also morality. Vishnu represents morality, moral order. Shiva represents total creativity. And the goddess represents the projection of both of these through us. And the evolution, you also have Shiva and the goddess as complementary pair. And that's called Ardha Narishwar, half Nari, Nari meaning the goddess, and half Shiva. So there are all these complementarities, and that is the beauty of the Vedic tradition. It acknowledges this all. It's all totally systematic. It doesn't just say there's only this or there's only that. No, all of this. There is paradox. There is opposition. And through your journey, personal journey, you must find that space where you are able to bridge that paradox and be the Shiva within yourself.
Wow. Okay, so let's see. I want to ask you about one of your chapters in your book. About, you mentioned Tesla and Vivekananda. Do you know more about these? Could you extrapolate a little on about these two? How were they ahead of their time? And is it possible to harness the power of the Akashic field in science? Do you think we can harness the power of the universe for energy?
Well, what Tesla was trying to do, as you know, the story that I mentioned is that Tesla was the most famous engineer in America in the 1890s, because he argued for AC, alternating current, and Edison was for direct current, and AC won. Westinghouse then started building AC engines. So he was very famous. And Vivekananda was visiting New York. So they met at a party. Somebody, in fact, famous French actress who was also in New York, she threw a party and she invited both Vivekananda and Tesla. And they were closeted together. They were talking to each other. So, and Tesla wrote about it in his diary, and Vivekananda wrote about it in a letter. So we know what transpired. So apparently, Vivekananda told Tesla that, look, energy and mass are interconvertible according to the Vedic tradition. And that's what got Tesla inspired to look for how energy could be transmitted from one place to another. So he was a great proponent for that. And it's also been conjectured that Einstein's first wife, she was a Serbian like Tesla. And she may have been in touch, or she may have been in touch with Tesla, because Tesla was the most famous Serbian of all. And he may have told her that, look, try to look for a equivalence between energy and mass. E equal to mc squared, which was in 1905, the famous paper by Einstein. But the first draft of that paper also had his wife's name as a co-author. So is it possible that there was a Tesla connection, which people have conjectured? You can't prove it one way or the other. But Akashic field, what is Akashic field? Akash is not space. Normally we take Akash to be space. Akash is what is between consciousness and the other four elements. The other four elements are earth, water, fire, and air. So Akash, which is a part of our body, right? We are made of these elements. Our brain is made of these elements. So where do we get knowledge from? Well, Akash is where Akash is mediating consciousness and our physical body. And of course, Akash is everywhere. It's within us as well. And consciousness is also within us. So if you knew how to be one with the Akash within yourself, that's when you open yourself to consciousness, to Shiva, and all possible, all amazing gifts that there are for everybody to have.
Wow. Okay. Um, so let's see what else. So you mentioned somewhere about something that Dr. Ambedkar said is also something similar to what you have said before, that after independence, India got political independence, but we are still very far from having intellectual and social independence. Um, do you know how we can remedy this in Indian society? I think it's true in other nations as well that there is political independence, but there's not. I mean, you talk about the colonization of the Indian mind, and also I think Dr. Ambedkar also talks about that a little bit too. He calls it. He says there's a top dressing of political independence, but our society will still be very unequal. I think in the way you talk about it more so from a mental level, intellectually speaking. Do you know how we can, what steps we can take to fix this? Um,
Well, one is to accept what is good everywhere. I'm not chauvinistic. I'm not saying reject the West. No, West is wonderful stuff. I know a lot about Western creativity, literature, arts, all the sciences. We must embrace what is wonderful in all cultures and civilizations, right? So that I'm for one. But in order to proceed, and this is something I discuss quite at length in my newest book called The Age of AI, The Age of Artificial Intelligence, where I argue how these issues are going to be important for in the next few decades as different nations compete with each other to be number one in AI, because that is going to be the technology which will tell you which country is the most powerful one. And I do bring this up, and that India right now, India is the third largest economy by PPP reckoning, purchasing power parity, and fifth largest by nominal dollar terms. But India is not pulling its weight. See, you look at AI apps. China is there, US is there, India is not anywhere at all. Why? Because the minds of Indians are still colonized. Indians still lack self-confidence in taking up these challenges. So do read this book. You'll find a lot of interesting stuff which is relevant to not only India but the entire world. Because I look at different regions. I look at Europe, Russia, China, and India, and look at the peculiarities and uniqueness of their cultures, which bring in different strengths for this emerging race in the world.
so why you, I've seen some podcasts you've done with other people, um, and I'm curious as to why you think the problem more so is not with the Western world, but with Indians claiming the narrative and the agency. I think in past podcasts you call it carpe diem, to seize the moment. Why do you think it's more so a problem of Indians to shape their own agency and narrative?
Well, because their minds are colonized, they're quite comfortable. If you've gone to a school and college in India and you've been taught certain things, you don't know anything else. You believe that whatever is being talked about the Vedas is probably all hogwash. And if you think it's hogwash, then you don't want to get into it. And I don't blame a person. If you've grown up and you've been a good student, you believe what your teachers have taught you. That's why these podcasts now, and the fact that knowledge has become much more democratized, is opening up all of this. People don't even know that consciousness is a problem. And in high school level or even at college level, most Professors will tell you we know everything. Everything about the universe is known now, which is hogwash, right? We don't know who we are, right? Or where consciousness comes in. The greatest scientists know that our knowledge is incomplete. But second tier or teachers don't know that. So they are dogmatic. So everybody, even in the West, people need to free themselves from dogma. That's the only way. If Indians are in trouble, the Westerners are also in trouble. Indians are in trouble because of colonized minds. Westerners are also in trouble because their minds are also colonized by Hollywood and by reductionist ideas, right? That we are only bodies. So it's a problem all over the world. But Indians are in some sense lucky because they are inheritors to this amazing tradition, right? And so they have to seize agency. They have to say, okay, we love the West also. We love West. We love all wonderful stuff from wherever it might be. But now we have this great tradition. And let's marry that tradition to technology. Let's create new platforms, new ways of doing things. Let's advance science, especially health, medical science, because medical science is another crisis. Look, America's longevity is 8 years shorter than that of other countries of the world, other developed countries of the world, because Western medical science is in shambles. Everybody's medicated. There are some people who take 20 or 30 pills in the morning. They are not being themselves. Everybody, you have side effects. So I think while we may bemoan the fact that Indians have been colonized, but now in some sense it doesn't matter. Everybody is on level ground, and India has a lot of money as well and resources and so on. So now is the time for Indians to teach what is unique about them, which is going to be helpful to others. Just as we are very happy to learn modern architecture from a European architect, right? So we should also be teaching all the wonderful stuff that we know from in linguistics or psychology and everything else to people from all corners of the world.
Okay. So you talk about this a little bit. What do you think what is the fundamental mystery of consciousness that has to be unveiled? What is it? Does it have to do with quantum computing or AI or something that the Indian sages had left for us to?
It's about who the observer is. And that paper I mentioned earlier on called No-Go Theorems in Machine Consciousness has a theorem called the one observer theorem. And it's called the one observer theorem. And according to it, there is only one observer, which is the same thing as saying there's only one consciousness. And it's a mathematical theorem. You might want to take a look at it. So that is the mystery. The mystery is that of the observer, and that there is only one observer. It's like there's only one gravitational field, whether you are next to the moon or the sun, it's only one gravitational field. Likewise, no matter who the individual is or an animal, they also have consciousness, right? But that consciousness is one, although the possessor of that consciousness in that animal brain is different, is many.
I've actually heard that is. I think I've read somewhere that Advaita Vedanta and even Kashmiri Shaivism talk about that. They talk about the observer. It's the same thing, right? And
absolutely.
And I've
Except
heard of
that I gave a mathematical proof there.
Right. I should look at it. But I've heard modern day Indian gurus such as I don't know if you heard of Jiddu Krishnamurti. He talks about that too, the observer and the observed. Um, and I think that also radically could change how humans interact with one another as well, because if the observer and the observed are the same, then that has repercussions for how we look at one another as well, in terms of humanity,
Empathy,
empathy.
empathy,
Yeah.
empathy. And that's a wonderful thing, because there are certain other traditions who say that kill the non-believer, right? There's no such thing in Advaita Vedanta. We say everybody and animals as well, which doesn't mean that everybody has to be vegetarian. No, no. We also believe that in the embodied world, there is a food chain. You know, the big fish would eat the smaller fish, because ultimately the Atman is the same. Consciousness is the same, right? As the Bhagavad Gita says, it's the same consciousness that resides within all beings. So it's a practical thing. It doesn't say that now you can't cut down a tree because tree is also living, or you can't, if you want to still, eat animals. Well, that is the way the world is, and that's perfectly fine. But you have to realize you can't do unnecessary violence, because ultimately everybody else is like you. And if you approach others through with a sense of friendliness, other human beings and other societies and animals, that'll be good for everybody, including for ourselves. That's the takeaway.
Hmm. So, I mean, I think of the idea of the Atman and consciousness, unity consciousness, in that, in the Enlightenment era, we've gotten these ideas of all men are created equal. But it seems like these ideas go very far back that many people are not aware of, that these ideas are very ancient as well, But yeah, so it's interesting that we say that this idea came from the 18th century, but when you think of Atman and consciousness, that idea speaks more to human equality than anything really. How?
Right. And in a much more radical way, I'll tell you how. In the Western view, people say, you have critical race theory, etc. They want everybody should to have the same performance, right? So let's not have any advanced class because some groups may not do well. The Indian way actually is more positive in the following sense. It says anybody, no matter what race or gender they belong to, through effort, they can aspire to reach the same level, because it's the same Atman. It's not, we are not governed totally by biology. While the Western view would be that we are governed by our biology. They would say, well, maybe this is what Subhash Kak can do, this is what Sunny Sharma can do because of who his parents were. While the Indian way is really through special effort, extraordinary effort. Almost anybody can do anything, which is a very, very big statement. It's a
Hmm.
very, very, I don't think almost no Western psychologists would actually get it, because they're still in the back of their mind, they're still governed by the reductionist view that biology is destiny. While the Indian view is biology is destiny to a great extent, but you can transcend it, because beyond the multiplicity of biology is the unity of the Atman, which is where everything is.
Wow, that's very interesting. Um, so you've mentioned before that what was done in Europe in the past, I believe it happened in the 18th and 19th century. You talk about how many academies were formed in order to look at their history more objectively. And you say something similar has to happen in India. Has this happened yet, or do you think could you extrapolate a little about why that has to take place? Um,
Because it's good to be because objectivity is one aspect of existence. Mind or consciousness is one, but objectivity is another. Unity is one, multiplicity is another. So you can't just brush aside multiplicity and talk in terms of two big generalities, as sometimes Indian gurus do. You also have to grapple with multiplicity. And for that, you need objective history. So I think both sides, Western side is very valuable as well. That viewpoint is very valuable as well. And perhaps the problem that arose in India during the Middle Ages was the scale bent too much towards unity. And you have to come somewhere in the middle. You have to juggle both these aspects. And perhaps that is happening now.
Interesting. Okay. Um, so I have kind of a history question for you. Um, when do you think the modern day conception of a united India came into being? We think of people like Ashoka or the Mughal Emperor Akbar, or the councils that formed in India when India was under the British Raj. And there are many regions in India right now that, like there's the Khalistan movement, there's Kashmir Azadi. So many people are questioning whether certain parts of India were integral parts of the nation. Um, do you know? I don't know if you know this, but when do you think was the first modern day uh, interpretation of a united India?
Well, you can look at it either through Sanskrit texts, but they're not modern day India. In Sanskrit texts, you have the conception of one Bharat, right? Descendants of Bharat, who lived from the Himalayas to the sea and so on. So we are not talking about that. We are talking about modern day India. Modern day India, clearly, you have to go back to our or India's recent historical experience. And the most recent is the British times. And as we know, Britain ruled over India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, um, Sri Lanka, and also Burma, and in fact, even Malaysia. What is Malaysia right now? So Burma was separated, I think, 1930s or something. So the rest of it, so that is the modern day conception. It goes back to the British because it was under one uh, centralized administration. Of course, the Maharajas had a limited amount of autonomy, like the Kashmiri Maharaja had limited autonomy. There was a British resident who lived in Srinagar, who sort of oversaw whether things were okay, and Britain didn't have any objection to what was being done. So I would say yes, it is a modern idea. Modern idea, maybe 200 years old, 250 years old. Or if you were to go back to uh, Aurangzeb, because Aurangzeb ruled most of it. But after that, look at the Marathas. Marathas also conquered back from the Mughals most of India. So it is prior to the British. The British were following up on what the Marathas and the Mughals had done. And the Mughals and the Marathas were following up on what was there before. Although, just like Europe during medieval times also had a period when there were many, many principalities and many states which were warring with each other, right? And then it came together. So India has also gone through those phases. You have a centralized ruler, and then the center can't hold, the states separate out, then somebody else arises. And that will continue to happen, especially now with new technology, as you see it happening even in the West. Donald Trump is saying that, well, maybe Canada should be America's 51st state, and Finland should be a part of the US as well. And likewise, in Pakistan, because Pakistan is in a very sorry state financially, there are people in Pakistan who are saying that maybe Pakistan should enter into a confederation with India right now. We don't want to hear that, but not on their terms.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, just out of curiosity, what do you think of the legacy of Prime Minister Nehru? He was a very well-read Indian. He was very well-traveled. He kind of imposed the socialist agenda on the formation of the Indian political system. Um, you mentioned him in your autobiography as well. What do you think his legacy speaks to? Um,
Well, complicated. Um, I think his emphasis on socialism was wrong. Now, with hindsight, at that time, you can't blame him because at that time in the 50s, a lot of the very smart intellectuals in the West, in Britain, and elsewhere thought that socialism was the way to go. And people looked at Soviet Union. They put the Sputnik in space. They beat Americans to it. So people thought maybe that is the only way uh, we can progress fast. But that was a mistake, and maybe over centralization. But in fairness to him, India was very poor at that time. He didn't have much resources. I can tell you one personal story. I think the year was 59. I was walking in Anantnag. I had to walk 2 miles to college. I was walking in Anantnag. I saw one ambassador car coming from the other side, and I looked, and it was just a single car. There was Bakshi Ghulam Muhammad and Jawaharlal Nehru at the back of the car. There was no other police cars. All of Jammu and Kashmir state, which is huge in terms of area. I can tell you in 1959, there were only 850 automobiles. And how do I know? Our next door neighbor in Anantnag, he was a lawyer. His son didn't do well at school. So the father said, well, why don't you get a truck, be a truck driver? So he became a truck driver. His truck's number was J&K 850. At that time, all the nameplates or the license plates of trucks or of all cars, automobiles in J&K were numbered consecutively from 1, 2, 3. His was 850. There were only 850 cars. Can you believe it? Automobiles in J&K state, huge state. So India was extremely poor. Sometimes it's not fair to back project our understanding of what the world is like now to that time. But I would hold him responsible for one very big mistake, which was to stop the Indian army when it was in a position to retake the rest of the J&K state, which is still under the occupation of Pakistan, because it really belonged to the Maharaja. By law, it was, and the Maharaja had joined up with India. So he should have stopped. He shouldn't have gone to the United Nations. So that was a big mistake.
Hmm. I mean, yeah, I've heard of that as well about that blunder with Kashmir. But I've heard from an Indian ambassador who was very old, who was interviewed, and he said similar to what you said, that many people don't understand that India was in a very, very dire situation at that time because of how destitute it was after the British left. And I see that, and I think, I think Nehru did a good job establishing the education system in India and the science and industry. So I give him credit for that. Um, let's see, what else do I have? So in a conversation you had with somebody, you mentioned how Vedanta and Sanskrit is very nuanced when compared to English. And you say it brings in materialism and consciousness, the ideas of materialism and consciousness both at the same time. What do you mean by that?
See, the Sanskrit tradition is great because the language is organized so systematically. There are roots, and you can combine them with prefixes and suffixes to create words, right? So, and since it's so systematic, what when you learn Sanskrit or when you learn Sanskrit words, and it's very easy to do it now, there are great internet resources, it makes you start thinking. It's not just objects. You look at English words, they're all unrelated. And of course, you have to remember them associationally, right? I talked about 3 kinds of knowledge. In Sanskrit, because of its very nature, it makes you go into start to think about, hey, what does this word really mean? And how is it related to other words, right? So it promotes, I'm not saying it's essential, but it aids this process of reflection, self-reflection, and self-discovery. I think that's a great thing. I would recommend to anybody, whether they are from the West or from India or any part of the world, to learn Sanskrit, because it's an incredible, unique language. There's no other like it. And it's got the most remarkable literature. And a lot of it which is available in translation, but it's great just to play with Sanskrit words in your own mind and think about it. What does it really mean? And how is it connected to some other word and all that?
So the in the Upanishads, there's a verse that says, I don't remember the exact verse, but it says that um being led by blind people can lead you down the wrong path. And you mentioned this in one of your conversations. Why do you think after 1947 India has been led? Do you think India has been led down the wrong path? I mean, I would say India is a great success story. Maybe not a great success story, but is a success story because it came out of such dire circumstances, and I mean, there has been a lot of development. But do you think that there has been some misdirection in India by the political leaders or the intellectual or the bourgeoisie? Um,
Certainly, but you can say that of almost any country. Now look at Europe. Europe was doing well 30, 40 years ago. Now look at the dire strait Europe is in right now, right? Crime. Sweden, which was such a beautiful place, is the rape capital of the world. Uh, its rape rate is, I don't know, 10, 20 times more higher than that of even other neighboring countries. So, history is a complicated river. All kinds of things happen. And people come in, and at that time, certain decisions are taken. Why did this happen to Sweden? Because its leaders said, well, we believe in empathy, believe in being good to people from all over the world. Let's take in refugees from all over the world without thinking about how you need to see that will they assimilate or not? Is there a kind of a conflict in their in immigrants' view of reality to yours? And I'm not being racist or anything on this. I'm just talking about people from any part of the world, from the same part of the world, could have different perspectives. Maybe they should have had greater checks on seeing whether the people who are coming in will be ready to assimilate or not. And maybe some people would have been from the same countries that they took people in, and the people they took in were the wrong kind of people that they took. So I think India has also made mistakes, but many of those mistakes are being corrected. Some are still not being corrected because, as when it comes to social groups, there are different groups fighting for the same resources. Then they form alliances, and then they attach to certain ideas which may be destructive, and that's happened. For example, Mr. Rahul Gandhi is insisting on expansion of the quota regime. During Biden's administration, DEI, they did an expansion of that, and that was bad. And now, of course, a decisive person like Trump comes in, and in one day, he gets rid of it all. DEI is gone. While in India, Indians are more incremental. And Indian politics is such that you can't be that decisive. It doesn't have a presidential form of government, right? It's got a Westminster parliamentary form of government where the prime minister cannot take decisions just by himself or herself. So I think, yeah, certain good things have happened, certain bad things have happened. But India is not very badly placed right now. India is ready to take off, third largest economy, PPP terms. It could be the second or the first in the next 40 or 50 years, not on a per capita basis, but as in totality. In fact, more likely than not, it will be the largest economy. It will even overtake China. Why? Because China's population is collapsing, and
hmm,
there's nothing they can do about it.
hmm. Okay. Um, so I have a broader question to ask. Um, what is your perspective on truth in an era of misinformation and silos? How do we it seems like we are in an era of a lot of misinformation. I talk with some of my cousins in India who work in the IT sector in Bangalore, and they tell me that there's a lot of disinformation out there, and that I mean, some of my cousins say that the central problem of our era is how do we reach truth in an era of so much disinformation. Do you have a similar perspective on that, or what do you believe
That's
about?
all, Sunny. That's always been the case. But what had happened in the past was the the ruling party decided what was right information, and everything else had to conform to it because they were gatekeepers or religious gatekeepers. You know, a country became changed its religion, and then only what the new religion said had to be accepted as truth. In fact, it was a tyranny at that time, right? All across the world, religious tyranny, or tyranny related to ideologically. Remember, in Italy, they even burned Bruno for saying that Earth is not the center of the universe. He was burned at stake by the church, right?
Mhm.
So it is bad now, but not that bad, especially because of podcasts, because of social media, because of the internet. Information is available, which was not the case before. And that's why change is accelerating in India. For a long time after independence, you didn't know where to get information. You had just a few books in your school or college library, and then you had the radio. But the radio information was controlled by the government. But so now I think we are entering a golden age of free information, which is a good thing.
Mhm.
But it'll always be a challenge. In a free place, there would be people pushing their own information, which may not be accurate for whatever reason. Maybe they're living in their bubbles and they believe that bubble is right. So they want to say that that's the only correct information. But that is the whole thing of multiplicity or duality. There is going to be this contest between different takes on the world.
Okay. Um, so are you familiar with the historian Ramachandra Guha? Wait, can you hear me?
Yeah, of
Yeah.
course. Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
he made the claim that India would outlive the European Union. Um, what do you think about that statement?
That is quite possible. Europe is under tremendous strain for a variety of reasons. In 2008, when the financial crisis occurred, Europe's economy was the same size as US. Now they're only 40% of American economy. They are mired in socialism, in problems with immigrants. A lot of these people have come in who are 15, 20% of the population in some of the countries. Many of them don't work. So they have to support many of these people. And then you know the story of the rape gangs in Britain. Some people think that maybe as many as 200,000 poor white girls were sexually groomed and raped. That's horrible. Europe has terrible problems, and now people of the left control Europe's narrative until recently, but now parties of the right are winning in Italy, in Sweden, in Germany. Parties of the right are getting stronger. So, and then there is the Ukraine war. So the whole thing could come apart. And now there is Trump, and Trump is for America first. And Trump he wants Europe to pay its share of defending itself, of its security system, and that might place such strains on Europe that it may come apart. Europe is in trouble. India is in a much better situation, also because of India's tradition of wisdom. While in Europe, it's the left which controls a lot of their narratives. And that does not provide solutions to questions of life and death. If you say you're only the body, by left, I mean the idea that you're nothing but the body, and body is only to be, sensations is all that life is all
I had a question here. Let's see. So I have two more questions for you. then we can stop the recording. Um, what is your perspective on organized religion in the modern era? Do you think it is a necessity? You mentioned it in one of your books that the French Revolution sought to destroy organized religion. And organized religion is depending upon who you ask, it's a necessity or it's a problem in nations across the world, especially India, which is a country which has a lot of organized religion. Um, do you think organized religion is still necessary in our current society, or do you think it is fundamentally an issue?
Well, in the West, organized religion is sort of vanishing. In many Western countries, majority of people are saying that they don't belong to any religion. They don't go to church. And so in even in Iran, there are some claims that most people don't go to the mosques anymore. So old style organized religion is an attack. But then you could also say there is a new style organized religion, which is yoga. Another way of talking about the Vedic way is that it's really yoga. It's about yoga. You read the Bhagavad Gita, it says life is all about different kinds of yoga: yoga of action, yoga of knowledge, yoga of bhakti, right? Devotion. So that kind of, but that's not organized by a church, which controls everybody's thought. So these are yoga studios. You go to any country in the world, Peru, Argentina, Czechoslovakia, you'll find, even in villages, you'll find yoga studios. Maybe that's the way it should be. And you shouldn't have people who assemble everybody or make people assemble everywhere and then say kill the non-believers. That's not a good thing. That's not a good thing.
So I have two more questions for you. If there's one place everybody should visit, what should it be?
Well, all corners of the world are so beautiful. In the US or Europe or India or Africa or Australia, wherever, it depends on where you are or whether you want to visit a place near where you are. But recently, the most recent trips I took, one was a cruise from Vancouver to Alaska, which was quite nice. And then in December, I spent a couple of weeks in New York City, which was beautiful. New York City, we're living next to the Central Park. What a lovely place it is. It's one of the most beautiful places in the world. So there's beauty everywhere. But we live in Miami often. Miami is beautiful too, or even Oklahoma.
Okay. What was your I think I asked this before, but what was your impression of the Ashoka Edict about which had a very humanitarian outlook? Um, what was your impression of it?
Yes, the one that I talked about was near Dehradun. There's a place called Kalsi, and there's this edict there. Well, he talked about compassion and so on, which is a lot of the books in India talk about compassion. That if you want to grow, firstly you have to have peace within yourself. That's why, in fact, in the Indian tradition, they always say Shanti, 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 peace, peace, peace. Be at peace, be contented, which doesn't mean that you shouldn't work hard. Have ambition as well, but also have morality. Dharma means morality. Artha means ambition. Kama means desire. Have ambition, but within the guardrails of morality and and um, and sannyas. Sannyas is sacrifice. Also, be ready to give it up. These are the two guardrails: ambition and desire within the guardrails of morality and uh, to be prepared to give it up, not be attached, non-attachment. And I
Okay.
think that's very important.
And so last question. If there's one ancient and one modern Indian thinker you recommend for your audience, and one ancient book and one modern book.
Modern book, I don't know, all kinds of wonderful stuff. It depends on what genre you do. I remember liking Saul Bellow. I read a lot of his fiction, talking about an American writer, Saul Bellow, or Gunter Grass was a German writer. Now, all kinds of, there's such wonderful stuff. And now the great thing is it's all free on the internet. You can, all the classics are there for free. So, ancient book, uh, truly, the Upanishads are amazing. I recommend that everybody should read Upanishads. The word Upanishad means understanding. Up means next, ni means near, as in English, and shad is like sit. Next, near, sit. The student sat next to the teacher. So just like understanding in the Western tradition, the teacher spoke from a high ground, second floor, and the students were all standing. So the word understanding means to learn. Same way, the word Upanishad means to learn, sitting next to the teacher. And I think they are most wonderful. I think Schopenhauer, the German philosopher, said, they are the comfort of my life. When a person feels, at the dregs, the bottom, life is not worth living, go to the Upanishads. They are really inspirational. The
Wow.
most amazing stuff. Yeah.
And I mentioned before one ancient thinker and one modern thinker.
Um, well, a Roman writer I like very much, Marcus Aurelius. He was an emperor. I like him very much. Like he could be talking with us, and he was also a man of action. And modern modern thinker from India. I don't know. Aurobindo is great, but he's very difficult to read because his sentences run into pages sometimes, the same sentence, and he's not let go of his thought. Um, but I'll have to sort of think about it, which names to pick up
I've heard
in
many
addition.
people I've heard many people recommend those two people. Especially I've heard many Americans recommend Marcus Aurelius and Seneca. And I've heard many Indians recommend Sri Aurobindo. But I was unaware of how hard it is to read him. But um, I am familiar with Vivekananda though. I've read some of his stuff, which
Vivekananda's stuff is easy to read
yeah,
because
much
most of his
easier.
stuff he was giving lectures,
Right.
so they are conversational, so very easy to read. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, so with that, I'll stop the recording. Thank you so much, Dr. Kak, for coming on my podcast. I would love to have you on for future podcasts if you're willing. I think once I read more of your books, I think I'll have a lot more to ask you. So yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sunny. Thank you. Really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, okay. See ya. Let me stop the recording.